So welcome everyone to our first installment of Visionary Voices. I'm Amber Schrader. I'm the Executive Director of ATSA, and I'm thrilled to introduce our first guest to share his perspectives on our field of work. Originally trained as a clinical psychologist, Dr. Karl Hanson was a researcher with Public Safety Canada between 1999 and 2017 and is now president of SAARNA, the Society for the Advancement of Actuarial Risk Need Assessment. His research concerns risk assessment and rehabilitation for individuals in the criminal justice and forensic mental health systems, with a particular focus on individuals with a history of sexual offending. He has a strong interest in the statistical methods used to quantify risk and to evaluate change over time, and is the author of Prediction Statistics for Psychological Assessment. Welcome, Karl. Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks, Amber. It's great to be here.
So, to start off our little chat, I would love to hear your perspective on how it feels to be a visionary voice. Did you think you'd end up here someday?
Yeah. No, it's I guess before I even respond to that question, I'm just looking over the list of attendees, and so shout out to all my friends and colleagues and ex-students and all those people. And excuse me if I will retell stories which I've told many of you before, but there's some good ones. And one of the things about being an old person, you can tell stories and people say, yeah, that's okay. You can do it. You can retell the ones, those still chestnuts that you have told over and over again. Anyway, it's nice to see you out there. And it's actually nice to see all these people who I'm just sort of scanning the list who will go on to become visionaries in this field at some point in time. So it's really great to see this whole cycle repeating. Yeah. So yeah, there is a value in having professional status, and I'm grateful for it. And that I don't have to, scream and shout the same way I used to do to get people's attention. I know when I was starting out years and years ago, first of all, the field of sex offending and sexual abuse was not popular, like even in public discourse. So even raising the issue of sexual abuse as a object of study or of discussion was hard. It's not easy now, but it has become part of the popular discourse. We have lots of, in the last 20 years, it's really has changed and become something. As a beginner, I thought I had some good ideas and things to contribute, and the real experience of nobody listening. And not only nobody listening, but they'd listen and just say, you're wrong, right? And it's an interesting experience to have. And now people, there's one a quote from Skinner, which I really like, and he says that one of the reasons that older academics and older professionals don't do as well as younger professionals is because they stop getting contingent feedback. So people will say, oh yes, Dr. Skinner, that's a great idea, Dr. Skinner, without saying, no, that's wrong. That's goofy. Why do you think that? And so one of the things that you experience, and I think many of you experience now, and I hopefully will experience the rest of your life, is criticism. Super, super important. You have to put things out there, you have to be criticized, and you have to respond to that. And that's how we learn. And that's this whole field is a collective activity. There's not one person who's doing it. It's a collective activity. And it's putting stuff out there, getting responses, feedback, trying to make it better, moving along. And so I'm, I guess, grateful to be at a point where people actually listen to me, which is nice. And I hopefully that the things that I say are actually helpful and continue to poke at me, right? I don't want, I think Skinner's right. I think there's too many examples of people who are in like positions of prestige that just don't get the feedback they need. So I haven't quite rolled off the edge of the earth. I may soon. But as long as I'm still here and still saying things, let's engage. Let's engage. Let's think about it. Let's try to make things better.
It's really interesting you say that because one of the things we hear from our students really often is that it's just so intimidating to go up to some of the folks who have made such huge contributions to our field and engage and ask the questions they really want to ask. What would you say to those students who are in those moments and they're thinking about making the approach to you, but they're wavering and hemming and hawing? What would you say to them?
That's a good thing. I much prefer somebody who's noisy than somebody who's timid. And I think many of us would agree. So going up, and I guess the like the young people or the students or whatever, you know, it's not bad to be wrong, right? And make mistakes. That's not the process. It's not like you're never going to make mistakes. It's the courage to step out there, put your, neck on the line and just sort of jump the gun, so to speak, is necessary. It really is. If you're too timid, fine, you can live that way. But if you, and we may bite, there's no guarantee that it'll be a nice interaction, but it's worthwhile, right? It actually is worthwhile. And it's worthwhile for both of us. It's worthwhile for the person asking, and it's person for the more experienced person. We want to, and even if like, the question is not well formed, at least we know what people are thinking. We continue to need that feedback. Like it's so like there's so many stories of people who develop their little thing and they go off and they become sort of an echo chamber of their thing, and they don't get sort of feedback about what there's, what's really going on. So yeah, have courage, I guess I'd say. Have courage.
I think courage is such an interesting word in this line of work, in
Mm.
that is often criticized. Pretty early in your career, you set your focus on, individuals who cause sexual harm. What did courage look like to you then? And how did you find that inner courage to do this work and really speak about it, knowing that there were many who were going to have disdain for it?
Yeah. Yeah, I remember at one point I was like midlife and single, and I'd been working in this area for a while, and I was at a party, and I was dating basically, and this woman, you know, we did the smile, hi, how are you, sort of stuff. What do you do? And there's just this stone reaction about what I do, and he says, "You must have trouble finding dates." You know, it's there's you work with sexual offenders, right? It's great. Um, so yeah, in terms of what it is, everybody will have their different story, but my story was basically I grew up in a world where I knew people who were being sexually abused. I wasn't, but many of my friends and people were, and I knew it. There was, tragedy and crime around me. Um, and so when I actually stepped into this world, I knew what it felt like, right? So the issues, a lot of sexual abuse have to do with people being abused by people they know, often by relatives. I would know the victims as my friends, and I would know their abusers as my extended social network. They existed as real people. And the whole dynamic of talking about it, not talking about it. And when I was starting out, I remember looking at a textbook from the 80s, and it said that there's a whole, well, like a little chapter on incest. And the point of the chapter was why, incest is so rare. It happens, they said it happens 1 in a million cases is incest. And I thought, well, I live in a different world, right? I live in a quite different world than that. And then early in the 80s, there started Diana Russell, actually really quite important in doing victimization surveys. And she found numbers which more like, 1 in 10 or 2 in 10. It was really much higher numbers than people, and people reacted against them. Um, I didn't react against them because if I looked around at my friends and neighbors and stuff, I'm sort of nosy, and I sort of know what sort of goes on in the background. And the numbers in the surveys looked like the numbers that was seen in my social network. And this was actually reassuring for me. And it made my world seem like a more like the evidence, the public discourse was lining up with what I actually saw on the ground, or what my life was like. And so I thought this was an important issue. And I started being interested. I was trained as a clinical psychologist, and so I did a lot of work with, people who were anxious and depressed and going to, self-harm and these sorts of things. And I was concerned, like why did people end up this way? And a lot of them told stories of abuse. So there would be various forms of, bad backgrounds and things that they were dealing with. And I thought, well, let's, like, if we can go upstream a little bit, sounds like ATSA, but let's go upstream a little bit and see if we can stop that abuse. And at that time, this is again sort of mid to late 80s, I asked around and said, well, why do people do this, right? It's not obvious why people would want to, hurt others. I can see why people like to rob banks, like they like the money, but sexually abusing kids in your care or your relatives, or it's I'm just like, huh. And so I started asking questions, like, why do people do this? And the answers I got were things like, well, they're bad people. Okay. I said, well, I can do better than that. Right. And it opened me up to the idea that there was a need here that we just didn't know. There was nothing, like if I did the quick searches for information, there wasn't much. And so I thought this is worth working on. And so I started doing, and then eventually, actually, I found ATSA. This is one of those revelations on the road to Damascus. It was actually quite a revelation, because I started to meet people. It was through Ron Langevin, actually, who introduced me. Ron knew quite a bit about this area, but he introduced me to, Bill Marshall, Howard Barbary, Gene Abel, and these people actually knew something, and it was like, wow, now this, like, we can just jump forward. And I remember going to my first ATSA meeting way back in the 80s. And there was everybody could fit in the same room. The plenary was not a big room. And there was some debate going on. And they're going back and forth. And at one point, Bill Murphy got up, I remember it was Bill Murphy, and said, really, this is an empirical question. It's not something you argue about, you collect the data. And I thought, yeah, this is an organization I could belong to. And it was, it really, and I, basically attended, every ATSA for the next 30 years, essentially. And and it was interesting because at that point, people still weren't listening to me. There was no, like, I was saying stuff and people would just ignore me. But I thought it was important. And I was prepared to work on it, even if I failed. So even if there was no, like, if I struggled and failed, I would have had a life worth living. No, as it turned out, I struggled and succeeded in some areas, and that's life worth living too. But it was the commitment to doing it that sort of held me through. So when I got those, the obstacles and obscurations that we all get in life, it was like, okay, I've been hit by this, but the problem isn't going to go away. I need to, it's bigger than me. It's not about me. Let's see what I can do.
So as you're thinking about that and reflecting on those moments, what was the most challenging?
It's a good question. I say rejection and failure. You have a good idea, some may or may not have been a good idea, or you have something, you apply for jobs, you don't get them, you try for money, you don't get it, you submit a paper and people think it's the biggest piece of crap that ever's been done. There's a whole series like this. I wanted to, I was able to get jobs as a clinician, and many of you do, and this is actually very valuable work. But my vision had to do with understanding the field and actually contributing to it in a substantive way. And that's a different task. So there's opportunities for me to work as a clinician, but I don't know, there was like specifically risk assessment, and back then, and people who are of my generation will remember this, is we'd see people would ask, is he high risk or low risk or whatever, and we'd say something. But I started to wonder what the basis of what we're saying was. And I read some of the academic literature, John Monahan stuff that came out in the early 80s about how poor clinical judgment was. And here I am being, paid reasonably to be a clinical judge. And I just said, am I selling snake oil, right? I don't want to sell snake oil. So I started to, try to make it better. And, people may think, no, it's not better. I like my snake oil. It's great. Finest of snakes from Arizona. It's so there's just like, and there's I guess it goes along with that. The reason that it's hard has to do with some level of self-doubt. That you think that, well, maybe you can't do it, or maybe they're right. Maybe it's all stupid stuff that I've been doing. But then you sort of backtrack, start at the basics, and just work your way up slowly. Again, it's not really about you. It's just what needs to be done. You just chip away at it.
So when you had those moments and you were thinking like, is this all crazy? Was it ATSA? Was it folks within ATSA? Who did you rely on to bounce off of to get that sense of affirmation? I need to keep going.
Yeah, ATSA provided a number of people. There was I have some actually quite good mentors in this field, and quite lucky to have them. Early on, Ron Langevin was very helpful to me. He was, for those people who don't remember, he started the Sexual Abuse Journal way back when. I remember the party when it was started, and everybody could, come to his party and sign up for the first issue of Volume 1 of, it was called the Annals of Sex Research at that time. And 2/3 of the articles were by Langevin and all. So it was a rough start, but it got going. But he was helpful. He was very helpful. Howard Barbary really was nice to me. He took that sort of, okay, let me show you here type of thing. And I had no official relationship with it all. I would just write him, I'd visit him. I'd just say, can I come to Kingston? And I'd show up, and he'd actually be very helpful. So, and he kept being helpful throughout the I guess probably would still be helpful if I asked him for something right now. And Bill Marshall was also very helpful in that regard. A little while later, I got a job with the Public Safety Canada. And my immediate boss there was a guy called Jim Bonta, who was fantastic. He was, he not only did he know stuff about, crime and corrections, but he was a really good boss. It took me about 2 years to figure out what he was all about. But once I sort of figured out how he works and what he was doing, we had a great sort of relationship. And he taught me a lot about, I guess, how do you affect systems change in crime and corrections? And I also learned, a lot about the risk-need responsivity model from, the horse's mouth, so to speak. They were developing it essentially, in the office, a couple halls down, a couple offices over. So I had a chance to see very much how that model was being developed and applied. And he gave me lots of very helpful ideas. And he was excellent in that. And he would, how do you deal with failure? I was completely prepared to go into his office and say, I screwed up, and he'd say, okay, well, let's see what we can do about that. So it was a very rewarding sort of, boss-employee relationship.
As you're talking about your mentors, I can't help but notice some of the similarities that I think others would identify about you as you become a mentor to so many. How does it feel to make that shift from mentee to mentor?
Looking who's on the list here today. Um, one, I'll just shout out to one is Greg Carey's on the list. He was my first doctoral student. So he's actually, hi, Greg, how are you doing? It's interesting. Because I had mentors, I knew what it felt like, and I knew what the relationships were felt like. And it's a non-trivial relationship. It's like well, it's like raising an adult kid. And it's like it's time limited in some sense, but it's really deep. And it reminded me of like Carl Jung's image of psychotherapy is two people on swings, they swing back and forth, and at one point they jump and they catch each other. It feels a bit like that because there's a dependency that happens. Like you commit time, energy, space to somebody, and there's no guarantee that it's going to work. It could collapse entirely. They could come back and bite you, or they could disappear. And then when it works, then there's this real, credible power that is developed for both. And I trace back some of my good ideas where have to do with questions that my proteges asked me. What about this? And it's like, oh, yeah, right. And it's like, yeah, that's a great question, and I actually have an answer. Let's see if that one works. So no, it's quite gratifying, and I've got to the point now where I've got academic grandchildren. So my first or my mid round of proteges are now mid-career academics who have students who seem to be doing interesting things that I like to read. So that's gratifying, and that's people talk about grandparents, grandparent experiences. They can sort of step back a bit. They can play with the grandkids, but they don't really have to take care of them anymore. And there's a bit of like, oh yeah, the world's unfolding as it should. There's another generation coming up. We'll see what they do. It's sort of nice. I like it.
Lovely. Speaking of your proteges, in many ways, you've started to pass the baton on to your proteges. What's the one or two things you really hope they'll carry forward from what they've learned from you and the work you do?
Hmm. Yeah. One thing that I hope they carry forward. It's not one thing. It's the protege mentor relationship is one of it's almost like sharing world visions. And I don't share with my proteges my whole world. Like there's Karl Hanson is more than Karl Hanson, the Dr. Karl Hanson thing. But I have a well-developed and I think quite interesting professional worldview. And it probably takes about 3 or 4 years to learn. And some of them have learned it. And there's a whole bunch of bits and pieces of it. It has to do with, technical skills and research, but it also values about what's important, how to prioritize tasks, how to say no. And some it comes down to like how to dress and who do you talk to. There are like there's a whole range of like there's this professional thing. And once it's sort of passed on, it becomes them, right? It becomes who they are, it becomes part of and some of them start closer to that. Some of them are a little further away. And I don't expect them to become exact Karl clones. That wouldn't even be good. But there's a quality of sort of, I guess, core values, a sense of purpose, like this is a life worth living, coming back to that. These are activities worth sacrificing for. And here's how to do it. And I guess also with a bit like children, they never quite go away. They, if I get lots of, people reaching out and asking me things and stuff, but if one of my, former students asks me a question or reaches out to me, I'll respond, and I'll take it seriously. So there's these relationships last, I suspect until, as long as I'm competent to respond, I will.
A few times as we've been chatting, you said in the beginning, no one listened to you and you were just a nobody.
Mm-hmm.
What was the moment that you knew that you had made it in this field?
Yeah. I don't think there was quite the moment that it was going to make it. I guess is probably more like it. It's really hard to tell. Like in retrospect, I go back and I was thinking, I remember there's a period of time in the late 90s, probably, or maybe mid 90s, I guess. Richard Laws. Richard Laws was also very, very nice to me. And he made a bunch of things happen that I otherwise. He's to be credited for the. He introduced me to David Thornton and said, "You two will like each other," which we probably wouldn't have Static 99 if it wasn't for Richard Laws. But one of the things that he did was there was Her Majesty's Prison Service, the UK, had these panels looking at sex offender programs, sexual recidivism programs that were being developed during that period of time. And I got invited onto them. And first of all, it's like, wow. It was great because I was sitting around the room with all these people who were my idols, right? And in those meetings, I had things I could really say. I could be there and be helpful. I didn't have the depth of knowledge of these other people, but I could understand what's going on. I could make, and people listened to me. And then, in terms of my sort of way of going about things, I'm very evidence-based. And there's the old image of, ATSA being an evidence-based organization. When you get stuck, you go back to the evidence. And so I was able to read the evidence, interpret it, talk to it. And that gave me confidence. And that I sort of would understand how do you translate evidence into practice.
So I think one of your skills that you just hit on is being able to translate evidence and research into language that policymakers and laymen could understand. How did you develop that skill and what advice would you give to people working towards that?
Yeah. Um, the first advice is to it's to be a good clinician or a good policymaker. So you ground yourself first in the challenges and the skills and the environment where the decisions are made. So even though I was trained as a clinical psychologist and worked at it for a number of years, most of my career I wasn't actually, treating people or doing individual assessments. But the experience of doing it certainly framed, what is possible, what could be done. Like what do people want to know? Um, and understanding that is super, super important. And then there's just straight technical skills that you need. You have to read, research, and understand it. In terms of sort of the pyramid of, the field, there's a few people like myself, and there's others who are attending this call today, um, who do research, and the research could inform practice. And some of us are better or worse at making that direct translation. But there's another group, and actually lots of them are on the call today, who aren't fundamentally researchers. They're, but they can understand it. They can read research, they can understand it, they can, talk to me about research, um, and then they translate it into practice, and they're worth gold. They make the field what it is. If people do research studies and publish them, that's great, and that has to happen. But there's this knowledge dissemination function, which is really hard to do. It is like even people with PhDs, I'd probably say this, most people with PhDs aren't able to read a research article and determine whether it's practice relevant or not. That's a really hard skill. Um, but as I say, I'm looking at the list of people, and yeah, many of you guys are pretty good at this. And this is really important. And so when I find people who, read research, ask me informed questions about what it means for practice, it's like, yes, this is great. And those are the people who are often presenting at conferences and showing up as expert witnesses. And um, it's and that most of them come from, they're practice leaders, I'd probably say. But not all practice leaders have this skill. They come from the community of practice leaders.
Super interesting. So, what impact do you think your work has had on public safety, on that, what you started out to do
Yeah,
to stop victimization?
yeah. I don't. It's an interesting question, and my perception of what's changed over the years is one of the things that we're much more able to talk about sexual abuse. The whole Me Too thing, is a contemporary, but there's been versions of it for the last 20 years, and this is a real change. I talked to, people in my mother's generation, and she worked in masculine jobs at certain times, like oil fields and things like that. And she said that, sexual abuse was just what you did, right? If you're going there, you have to be prepared to slap people back. And that's changed. I couldn't say it's completely gone, but the idea that you could grope your coworkers with impunity is not part of our culture anymore. So that's really good. Um, I think there's been a real recognition of the risks and consequences of sexual abuse of children. I think that's been really important. And I guess one of the people being out there talking about it. I know that when I was first starting out, I spent a lot of time, saying, pay attention to this. This is important. Um, and in some ways, what I'm doing now is actually sort of saying, well, wait a minute. Maybe they're not all demon monsters. so that there's been a sort of a switch. I think the rates have, I think, gone down, and I think in just about every area except for internet sex crime, for the obvious reason that more people are on the internet. That's gone up dramatically. I think there's a bit of justice that I've been able to contribute to, and that I think the people who are identified a high risk nowadays are probably more likely to be high risk than what we did in the past. And I think that, in some systems, not all systems, that people who are legitimately low risk can sort of shuffle out of the system a little sooner. I think that's possible. I still, um, I, I'm still concerned about treatment targets. So if I summarize what I've done essentially in my career, if I was going to write the history of Karl Hanson's contribution to science or whatever, I've articulated the risks and factors for sexual recidivism, roughly. We knew quite a bit of the risk factors for general crime before, and we're still working on that. But I basically collected all that information and made pretty strong statements about what are the risk factors. And I can, and now most people would agree. I don't get any pushback on whether something is or is not. That's basically been done. We'll tweak it a little bit over the years, but we basically know that. And I think, I hope anyway, that it informs practice so that people will know what to focus on more now than before. That being said, there's real pulls. If clinical practice isn't disciplined by evidence, there's sort of a laziness that happens where you start working with low risk people because they're nice and they may want to work with you. You also start working on things which you just don't like about them. They may be a bit irritating in certain ways, and you think this is and I used to work as a clinician, so I find myself doing it, and I find myself treating something in somebody, and it's like, is this really risk relevant? Is that what they want to work on? But it's something which I find irritating about them, right? So there's real pulls to do like clinical practice that is not going to be actually helpful. And so I think we still have lots of room to go in, training like the direct clinicians and, the programs as structured as programs to include things which are, in the risk need responsivity model really needs, as opposed to just things you don't like about them. So I think my suspicion or my hope is that the programs are getting better. People are much more knowledgeable, because years ago I used to give these examples of, I do these risk assessment trainings, and I'd put up 2 cases with various characteristics, and then I ask people to decide which one's more high risk, and they debate, and no one would agree, and people would point to various things. And after about 2000, I stopped doing that because everybody would they'd make a little checklist of risk factors and check it off, and they'd basically be able to do the same analysis I was going to be able to do. So it didn't generate debate. They just, okay, he'd have a static score of 6, and that would be about a static score of 1, and all this other stuff was noise. So that has percolated into practice, generally. And if you look at the training, ATSA types of trainings, it's all percolated in there very much. We don't really have evidence-based treatment. We have some studies that look promising, that look but we don't really know what it is about these things that are actually making the difference. My hope is that because we know a lot more about the dynamic risk factors, and we're able to say now that changing dynamic risk factors is change in recidivism risk. We can use change in dynamic risk factors as the dependent variable in treatment outcome studies. So in the past, we weren't able to do that. Like 20 years ago, we couldn't do that. Now we can. So we can experiment with different ways of delivering programs, group individual, the length of the program, we could keep track of, but we have an outcome measure. Like you can use that. And there's, risk tools that I've been involved with, but others as well, like shout out to the BRSSO and Mark Oliver's team, where you can have reliable, if a person has changed on these ways in this measurable way, they're lower risk. And so you can start asking the question, how do you get there the quickest, right? Or the most efficiently, or how does he get it to stay, right? And these are things you can do within timeframes of a year or two. Whereas with the sexual recidivism stuff, you need 5 to 10 years. It's just a long, bloody process. I know the original SOTIPS, the California one, started in the 80s, really, and didn't have, publishable results until the early 2000s. That's 20 years, and that's basically Janice Marcus's full career, right? She basically started that. It's a great project, well implemented, well evaluated, but they actually had to wait, right? They had to wait long enough. And, and I remember at the end of it, Janice and I were talking, and she said, well, I'm talking to some senators and it might be possible to do it again. Would you be interested? And she was saying, I'm near the end of my career. I'm not. And I said, do I want to do 20 years? With one project? It's like, oh boy. But right now, and I guess if I was giving you advice, like many of you are involved in direct service. Now, what you could do is like do stable scores at the beginning and stable scores at the end and keep track of them, right? Keep track of them and keep track of what you did, like what actually happened, how many hours, how many hours of intervention, what were your treatment targets. And if you document that type of thing, even if you do, a small number, if you document it well, then somebody will come along, one of these other young upstarts, and collate all that information, and you'll get some patterns that could actually be very useful. People may say, I'm getting really good changes on, this type of client when I do this type of thing. Wouldn't that be lovely? Wouldn't that be lovely?
That sounds like the dream, Karl.
Yeah.
I have one last question before we wrap up for the afternoon, depending where you are. If you could wave a magic wand, what would you change about society to reduce sexual violence?
May all children feel loved and safe.
It's that simple. Great answer.
I think
It's a great answer. I love it.
It'd make a huge difference. We end up with these problems we have because kids are vulnerable and we have to take care of them. And not every kid gets the foundations they need, and they become susceptible to all sorts of problems, eventually, of which sexual abuse is one, both as a victim and as an offender.
Yep. Thank you so much, Karl. I so appreciate that you were willing to take the time to chat with us today and to experiment with me on this new program called Visionary Voices. It was great fun to hear from you and to hear your perspective on all things in our field.
My pleasure.
Before we let everyone go, I just want to share that the next thing coming up here at ATSA is a webinar with actually one of Karl's proteges, Micah Helmus and Kelly Babchician.
Two
How
of
to
my
read and interpret.
proteges.
Two of your proteges, I'm so sorry. How to read, interpret, and apply the results of a meta-analysis. So a great opportunity for some of our clinicians to learn more about applying research and evidence-based to their practice. Okay. So thank you again, Karl. Have a great afternoon, everyone. And we look forward to chatting with you all again soon.